Welcome to the deep dive. Picture the control room of an airport, or the core banking systems that are processing millions of transactions a minute, or even a hospital network that's managing all our patient records.
These are the engines of modern life.
They are. And we have this implicit trust that they're being protected by the absolute best defense systems available.
And that trust, well, that brings us to one of the biggest paradoxes of our whole digital economy. The companies we hire, the technology we deploy to act as this, ultimate barrier against chaos.
Against state-sponsored hacking, corporate espionage, all of it.
Right. They inevitably become these points of profound centralized systemic risk. They're the ones holding the master key.
That is the core tension we are exploring today. Our mission is a deep dive into CrowdStrike Holdings, Inc.
Yeah.
We are looking at a company that successfully scaled from a small, really aggressive startup focused on catching the world's most sophisticated threat actors.
And we're talking Chinese espionage rings, Russian intelligence operations, the big leagues.
Exactly. To a multi-billion-dollar financial powerhouse that is now, well, it's utterly indispensable to global IT infrastructure.
The sources reveal just an incredible trajectory. I mean, they're a component of the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. They're reporting, US $3.95 billion in revenue for fiscal year 2025. They're an absolute leader in endpoint security and threat intelligence.
But the very success they achieved, the thing that made them so indispensable, is exactly what created the conditions for a failure of spectacular scale.
A failure that touched almost everyone.
We have to unpack that catastrophic day in July 2024 when a routine software update, an update issued by this company built to prevent cyber chaos, became the source of a massive, real-world global IT meltdown.
It grounded flights, it paralyzed 9/11 centers.
And it forced system administrators worldwide into a state of just absolute panic.
It's a study in complexity and concentration risks. So let's look at how they built that power base in the first place.
Okay, let's unpack this. So CrowdStrike wasn't founded to, sell firewalls or basic antivirus. It was purpose-built for high-stakes digital conflict.
Right from the beginning, the company launched in 2011, and the founding team had, deep experience in the security world. You had George Kurtz, the CEO.
Dmitry Alperovich, who was the former CTO, a huge name in the space.
A huge name. And Greg Marston, the CFO, who has since retired.
And what defines the company's identity right from the outset is this intense focus on the adversary, not just the technical artifact.
Exactly. They weren't interested in just generic malware. They wanted to name, shame, and track the state-sponsored groups behind the attacks. Their whole focus was forensic and attributional.
And they solidified this reputation really early on by bringing in some serious operational expertise.
Oh, yeah. In 2012, they made a key strategic hire, Sean Henry.
A former high-ranking official from the FBI. He was brought in to lead their subsidiary, CrowdStrike Services, Inc.
And that move, it signaled immediately that CrowdStrike was not just another software vendor. It was offering elite security and incident response services. It was bringing a kind of government-level investigative rigor to corporate cyber defense.
So when a major company or a government agency got hit with a complex breach, CrowdStrike wanted to be the team you called.
The specialized experienced team that would come in and figure out not just what happened, but who did it and why.
And that whole investigative mindset was baked directly into their first major product. In June 2013, they launched CrowdStrike Falcon.
Right. And while it functioned as an antivirus package, its real innovation, the thing that changed the game, was in endpoint detection and response, EDR.
So let's explain that, because it's a key concept. What does that actually mean for the listener?
Well, traditional antivirus was reactive. It scanned your computer for known signatures, fingerprints of malware that had already been identified.
So we'd only catch things it already knew about.
Precisely. Falcon, being cloud-based and focused on EDR, it shifted the whole emphasis to threat, intelligence, and proactive behavior analysis. It watched the endpoints, your laptop, your company's servers, for suspicious activity.
Activity that suggested a human adversary, a bad guy, as they put it, was present, even if they weren't using any known malware.
Yeah, this approach allowed them to spot the sophisticated, stealthy intruders that all the legacy systems were just completely missing.
And because they were monitoring for the most sophisticated threats, their early investigation portfolio was immediately relevant. It had significant geopolitical weight.
They were basically acting as an extension of national intelligence services, often making reports public that, the government couldn't or wouldn't for political reasons.
And this started almost immediately with their work on China.
Right. CrowdStrike's reports were absolutely central to the U.S. Department of Justice's decision in May of 2014 to actually charge 5 specific Chinese military hackers.
Which is a huge step. They moved from this abstract concept of state espionage to identifying specific, chargeable individuals within the Chinese military apparatus.
I mean, that is a massive operational leap for a private company.
And they also became experts in naming and tracking these specific Chinese state-sponsored groups. For instance, in 2014, they identified Putter Panda,
A group they traced all the way back to PLA Unit 61486. So again, they weren't just detecting malware, they were mapping the actual organizational structure of foreign military cyber units.
and this capability, this sort of ground truth they had, it gave them the confidence to be pretty provocative.
Oh, very. In October 2015, they reported alleged Chinese hacking that was targeting technology and pharmaceutical companies.
And what makes that report so significant is the timing.
The timing is everything. It came just after U.S. President Obama and China's leader Xi Jinping had struck this very public, high-level agreement promising not to conduct economic espionage against each other.
So CrowdStrike's findings essentially alleged a high-profile violation of that agreement almost as soon as the ink was dry.
It demonstrates incredible institutional confidence. But their focus wasn't only on China. They were just as active tracking Russian intelligence groups.
Right. They uncovered the activities of a group called Energetic Bear.
A group they linked directly to Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB. And what stood out about Energetic Bear was its primary target set.
The global energy sector.
The global energy sector. It showed this clear tactical connection between cyber operations and, securing influence over critical infrastructure.
And then, of course, there was the 2014 Sony Pictures hack, which was just a watershed moment in corporate cyber attack.
A huge moment.
Yeah.
And CrowdStrike was retained for the cleanup and analysis. They were instrumental in uncovering the evidence that implicated the government of North Korea.
They provided really granular detail, didn't they? I remember reading that they even used forensic clues, like a distinctive typo that was embedded in the malware code, to attribute the attack with high confidence.
That's right. They demonstrated the actual mechanics of how the attack was successfully carried out.
So their early history really establishes them as this ultimate, high-stakes digital detective focused on nation-state actors.
But it wasn't just about catching the attackers. It was also about identifying flaws deep within the foundational systems that run our entire digital world.
And that brings us to Venom. In May 2015, CrowdStrike released information about this really critical vulnerability.
And this wasn't malware. This was something much deeper, a profound flaw in the very architecture of cloud computing.
Okay, let's talk about the technical impact here, because it gets a little technical, but it's intensely relevant to their story. Venom was a critical flaw in QEU.
The Quick Emulator, an open-source hypervisor.
So for our listener, the hypervisor is that foundational software layer. It's what allows the big cloud providers like Google or AWS to run dozens or even hundreds of isolated secure virtual machines or VMs on a single piece of physical server hardware.
It's what keeps your cloud data separate from your neighbor's data.
It's supposed to be the unbreakable wall between those VMs.
Precisely. And Venom was a flaw that allowed a malicious actor, someone running code within a single contained virtual machine, say a testing sandbox, to execute a VM breakout.
Meaning the hacker could escape their designated digital cage.
And gain access to the physical server itself. And critically, access all the sensitive personal and corporate data stored on all the other virtual machines running on that same server.
That is just catastrophic for cloud security. It completely destroys the core principle of isolation that the entire modern cloud computing model is built on.
Yeah. CrowdStrike's discovery of Venom wasn't just another vulnerability finding. It was a demonstration to the market that they understood infrastructure security at the deepest possible level.
So was that an act of purely responsible disclosure, or was it a really savvy strategic marketing move designed to show off their foundational systems knowledge to prospective clients?
I mean, it was likely both, right? But the outcome was clear. CrowdStrike positioned itself as maybe the only company capable of fighting the biggest, most complex threats, whether they came from PLA Unit 64586 or a flaw in the fundamental architecture of the internet.
And that identity, high risk, high competence, high geopolitical relevance, that's the engine that drove their next phase. Just spectacular financial scaling.
The transition from that high-stakes consulting firm we just described to a multi-billion-dollar financial juggernaut was, it was breathtakingly fast.
It just directly reflects the sheer market demand for their unique, threat-centric, cloud-native security model.
The investor confidence was immediate. In July 2015, they secured their Series C funding, and that round notably included an investment from Google.
By May 2019, they had raised a remarkable total of $480 million in various funding rounds.
And the valuation milestones, they just illustrate how quickly the market recognized their indispensable position. They reached the revered unicorn status, a valuation over $1 billion by 2017.
And at that point, they were already estimating an annual recurring revenue of $100 million.
And the growth was truly exponential. By June 2018, just 1 year later, that valuation had jumped to over $3 billion.
They attracted some really serious institutional backing. We're talking Telstra, March Capital Partners, Rackspace, Excel Partners, Warburg Pincus.
These investors saw a company that wasn't just, disrupting a market, it was completely redefining it.
And that rapid ascent led directly to their blockbuster 2019 initial public offering on the NASDAQ.
An IPO where shares just soared over 70% in their trading debut, instantly valuing the company at more than $11 billion.
This market valuation wasn't just speculation. It was a firm statement that CrowdStrike was seen as an essential utility for the digital age, a critical piece of infrastructure in and of itself.
And that institutional validation just kept coming. It culminated in their inclusion in the prestigious S&P 500 index in June of 2024.
Right before the major incident we're going to discuss later. So to really understand the scale of their indispensable status, let's look at the raw financial trajectory over 5 fiscal years. This really appeals to the listener interested in scale and metrics.
Okay, so if we break down the revenue figures, which end on January 31st each year, the adoption rate of their Falcon platform becomes, well, abundantly clear.
So starting small, in fiscal year 2020, revenue stood at $481.4 million.
Then by fiscal year 2024, they had crossed the $3 billion mark, reaching $3.06 billion. That was a 36% increase over the prior year, FY23.
And the projected growth remains steep, which validates the whole investor thesis. For FY 2025, revenue hit $3.95 billion.
But maybe more telling than the revenue itself is the operational cash flow. In FY 2020, net cash flow from operations was $99.9 million.
By FY 2025, that figure had skyrocketed to $1.38 billion.
I mean, that level of cash generation suggests high margins, very efficient scaling, and critically, customer stickiness. Once Falcon is deployed in an organization, it is rarely removed.
That's compelling. But wait, how does a company that started with this high-cost, high-touch forensic consulting scale to billions in software revenue? Was this strategy just that good, or did they aggressively buy their market share?
Well, the acquisition strategy is where we see the answer. It's really a combination of both.
Right. The core Falcon platform was strong, but the digital threat landscape changes constantly, especially with the rapid shift to cloud infrastructure.
CrowdStrike realized they needed to be everywhere the data was, not just on the physical endpoint. So their aggressive acquisition strategy was designed to rapidly integrate all these new capabilities into the Falcon ecosystem.
Exactly. They weren't just buying companies for headcount, they were filling specific critical capability gaps. The acquisitions themselves, they tell the story of their strategic evolution from pure EDR to a comprehensive security platform.
Take their 2017 acquisition of Payload Security. That brought in automated malware analysis sandbox technology, which just sped up their ability to understand new threats.
Then a few years later, in 2020, they paid $96 million for Preempt Security. This was crucial for identity security.
It was. It integrated zero trust and conditional access capabilities directly into their platform.
And that move, it signaled the recognition that identity, who you are and what you have access to, was replacing the traditional network perimeter as the primary attack surface.
Then came the integration of massive data capabilities. In 2021, they spent $400 million on Humio, a really robust Danish log management platform.
Humio was a massive strategic purchase.
Oh, it was huge because it allowed CrowdStrike to pull in and analyze these huge volumes of telemetry data from all sorts of sources beyond just the endpoint logs, cloud infrastructure, network traffic. It's foundational for true extended detection and response, or XDR.
And later that same year, they bought Secure Circle, a SaaS-based service that pushed that zero trust philosophy even further by protecting the data itself, regardless of where it moved.
And they just continue to aggressively acquire, often targeting the innovation hub in Israel. In 2024 alone, they bought Flow Security for $200 million and Adaptive Shield for $300 million.
Both of which were focused heavily on cloud security posture and identity governance. It's a clear indication that cloud protection had become their central focus.
Even looking ahead, the 2025 agreement to acquire Onum, which focuses on managing real-time telemetry pipelines, it just confirms this constant evolution toward comprehensive data management.
The pace of these acquisitions, what is it, 10 major companies in 8 years?
Yeah.
It shows that to maintain their dominance, they recognized they had to constantly integrate new technologies. They couldn't just rely on organic development of the original Falcon system.
And this constant evolution is also evident in their own product innovation. In 2020 and 2022, they launched and evolved Falcon Identity Threat Protection.
Then came the inevitable industry shift toward artificial intelligence. In 2023, they introduced Charlotte AI.
Right, which they pitched as a generative AI security analyst designed to enhance automated threat triaging and response.
They're essentially building an AI-powered security co-pilot for their enterprise users.
They even democratized customization with Falcon Foundry in 2023, which is a no-code application development platform. The goal is to make their platform so comprehensive, so customizable, and so easy to use that no customer ever needs to look elsewhere.
And as you move up that threat chain, you're tracking state-sponsored actors, you're defending critical infrastructure, you're generating billions in revenue. You inevitably become intensely intertwined with one client above all others,
Yeah.
the U.S. government.
Absolutely. The sources confirm a clear strategic focus on working with the U.S. government and selling their services to federal agencies. When your product is integral to national defense, political engagement isn't optional.
It's a necessary cost of doing business.
Exactly. And their federal lobbying spending reflects this priority. It exceeded $620,000 in 2023, and they were on track to set a new record in 2024.
So when you combine that level of financial scale,
Yeah.
that technical indispensable status, and that high-level government engagement, you are dealing with a company that is not just a technology vendor, it's a critical geopolitical actor.
And nowhere was that geopolitical influence tested more controversially than in the attribution of Russian hacking. So if Section 1 established CrowdStrike's reputation for, catching spies, this section details the moment that reputation became tangled in international controversy and domestic political firestorms.
Yeah, we have to look closely at their role in investigating the 2015-2016 cyber attacks on the Democratic National Committee, the DNC.
This is a foundational event in modern cyber history. CrowdStrike was brought in to investigate the breach and their eventual conclusions that the attacks were the work of Russian intelligence services, specifically APT-28, or Fancy Bear, and APT-29, Cozy Bear.
Those conclusions became absolutely central to the public narrative surrounding foreign interference.
And that conclusion was reached alongside other highly respected firms like Mandiant and ThreatConnect. So in March 2017, then FBI Director James Comey testified before Congress, citing these private sector firms and stating that they concluded with high certainty that the hack was the work of known Russian intelligence services.
That is immense weight to give to a private firm's findings. But here's where the procedural controversy and the structural insight for our listener emerges.
Right. Because earlier, in January 2017, Director Comey had also testified that the FBI itself was actually denied direct forensic access to the physical DNC servers.
They had to rely instead on shared images, logs, and evidence that was provided by CrowdStrike.
This is a crucial point. It raises a really important question about the line between private sector intelligence and national security investigations. For years, the federal government has specialized forensic capabilities, but in this incredibly high-profile case, the evidence trail that shaped the entire U.S. political landscape was generated, curated, and handed over by a private, for-profit technology company.
It just illustrates how profoundly reliant federal agencies have become on the specialized, deep access expertise of companies like CrowdStrike.
Especially when a breach spans complex cloud environments and internal corporate systems that the FBI can't just walk into without a subpoena, or where the owners, prefer the speed and discretion of a private vendor.
It creates a fascinating power dynamic. The firm with the most sophisticated visibility into the threat often dictates the evidence that the government ultimately relies upon for its conclusions.
But the DNC hack wasn't the only attribution report involving Russian entities that generated controversy and required significant scrutiny.
We need to do a deep dive into the 2016 Ukrainian artillery app incident, because it's a perfect case study in the difficulty of verifying facts in a contested geopolitical domain.
Okay, so in December 2016, CrowdStrike released a highly detailed report. They claimed that the Russian government-affiliated group Fancy Bear had hacked a specialized Ukrainian artillery app called Outage.
An app that was reportedly used on tablet PCs for fire control calculations right there in the field.
And their conclusion had these immediate, tangible battlefield implications. CrowdStrike's report alleged that Russia had used this hack to cause large losses for Ukrainian artillery units.
They detailed their findings, too. They specifically noted the distribution of a hacked variation of the POPRD30 app, which used a specific piece of malware known as the X-agent implant on Ukrainian military forums.
It looked like irrefutable evidence of Russian cyber warfare translating directly into kinetic battlefield results.
But the problem arose almost immediately when authoritative sources provided a strong rebuttal and, frankly, a contradiction to the report's most dramatic claim, the large losses.
Right. The UK-based think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IS, publicly challenged the finding. They stated that CrowdStrike had wrongly used their data, and they denied that hacking was the cause of the reported artillery losses.
And even more pointedly, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense publicly rejected the CrowdStrike report.
They stated on the record that the actual losses suffered by their artillery units were much smaller than what CrowdStrike had reported. And crucially, they emphasized that these losses were not associated with Russian hacking.
This is where the complexity really hits home. You have a powerful, authoritative U.S. defense contractor stating one thing, and the military of the allegedly affected nation-state publicly stating the exact opposite.
It forces you to ask, what are the incentives at play here? CrowdStrike's incentive is often speed, attribution, and, marketing their unique insight.
While the Ukrainian military's incentive is secrecy, battlefield morale, and control over their own sensitive operational data.
It creates an immense fog of war. However, later research did lend significant credence to the fundamental claim of targeting, even if the claimed operational impact was disputed.
Right. The cybersecurity firm SecureWorks later published research showing a list of email addresses that had been targeted by fancy bear phishing attacks.
And that list included the email address of Yaroslav Shurstik, the very developer of the RTOS app that CrowdStrike had named in their original report.
And this targeting was subsequently confirmed by other major outlets. The Associated Press and Radio Free Europe research noted that this supporting evidence lends some credence to the original CrowdStrike report, showing that the app had, in fact, been targeted.
So the conclusion we draw here is nuanced. Fancy Bear was definitely targeting the app developer. That confirms CrowdStrike's highly accurate attribution and specific intelligence on the adversary's priorities.
However, the dramatic claim about battlefield losses, the most consequential part of the report, was definitively rejected by the Ministry of Defense on the ground.
This entire section just reinforces the high-risk environment in which CrowdStrike operates. They are dealing with national security, political sensitivities, and complex, rapidly changing intelligence. Their ability to catch spies and attribute attacks is unparalleled.
But their willingness to be so definitive about complex operational outcomes was seriously tested.
And that high certainty, that indispensable status, the power they accumulated over a decade of fighting nation-states, is precisely what made them so dangerous when they finally malfunction from within.
We now move to the ultimate moment of unintended consequence. We've established CrowdStrike's essential role as this multi-billion-dollar guardian of global systems. Now we have to analyze the day that Guardian turned into the ultimate global disruptor, July 19th, 2024.
The sheer mundanity of the cause is what makes the catastrophe even more profound. The incident trigger was a routine software configuration file update,
known as Channel File 291. It was pushed out to the Falcon Endpoint Detection and Response Agent.
A single, non-executable configuration file. That's all it took. Flaws within that update caused a massive logic error deep inside the Falcon sensor software.
And because that sensor runs with extreme low-level privileges, which it needs to detect rootkits and advanced threats, the failure was absolute.
The result was the blue screen of death, the BSOD, on millions of Microsoft Windows machines worldwide. But it wasn't just a single crash. The logic error forced the affected computers into an unusable boot loop.
Okay, let's explain the digital catch-22 for the listener. The system would attempt to start Windows.
Right, but before Windows could stabilize or even connect to the network, the Falcon agent, running deep in the operating system, would execute the faulty channel file 291.
The logic error would trigger the system crash, which would then immediately cause a reboot, starting the whole cycle over and over again.
The device was effectively bricked. It was unable to reach a stable environment long enough to receive a fix.
And this is where the scale of their success became the scale of the disaster. Because CrowdStrike's Falcon sensor is so widely adopted by major corporations, governments, critical infrastructure providers globally.
A single flawed file caused chaos rarely seen in the history of IT.
This is where it gets terrifying.
Yeah.
The real-world impact. We aren't talking about slow email. We saw commercial airline flights grounded worldwide because the systems integral to flight planning, gate operations, and air traffic control were just disabled.
Disruptions swept through critical services. Banking systems couldn't process transactions. Hospitals were struggling with patient records. Broadcasters, including Sky News, were temporarily taken offline.
And the most alarming public safety crisis came from the disruption to 911 emergency call centers across the U.S.
The reliance on this single piece of software was made painfully clear. It highlighted that the centralization of defense software, while efficient, creates a single point of failure that bypasses all traditional system redundancies.
So, once the flaw was identified, CrowdStrike issued a patch. But as we discussed, the technical mechanism of the failure itself created the ultimate challenge for remediation.
How do you patch a computer that can't stay online long enough to download the patch?
IT administrators worldwide were in a desperate scramble. The recommended solution involved these highly manual, labor-intensive steps. You had to boot the devices into safe mode or the Windows recovery environment to manually delete channel file 291.
But this fix was just fraught with complexity in a large enterprise environment.
Think about the barriers. This manual deletion required local administrator access, which is often tightly restricted in large corporate settings to prevent security breaches.
And for companies that used Microsoft's robust encryption, BitLocker, the administrator often needed the BitLocker recovery key just to access the command prompt.
Which is an extra layer of complication that turned a simple software bug into a multi-hour recovery process per machine.
The anecdotes from the ground were just chaotic. Microsoft even reported that some customers found a solution solely by rebooting the impacted devices up to 15 times in succession.
Just hoping that sheer luck would allow Windows to start in a state that bypassed the sensor's error just long enough for the system to stabilize or receive the patch.
That is not a procedure. That is an act of desperation on a massive scale.
And the financial fallout was immediate and staggering. Independent estimates put the cost to Fortune 500 companies alone at approximately $5.4 billion.
That's due to downtime, lost productivity, and all the remediation costs.
CrowdStrike stock reflected the panic. On the day of the incident, shares closed down 11.10%, a loss of $38.09 per share, and then fell another 13.46% 2 days later.
The company immediately went into severe crisis management mode. They published a preliminary post-incident review 5 days later, followed by a detailed root cause analysis on August 6, 2024.
And then came the attempt at an apology to their distribution channel partners, the resellers and providers who fielded the majority of the customer anger and spent days fixing machines.
Yes, the now infamous apology.
It reportedly involved sending emails containing Uber Eats gift cards.
Worth $10.
$10. Given that the incident cost their customers billions, the sheer tone deafness of a $10 meal voucher as compensation for crippling global infrastructure drew significant and, frankly, understandable backlash.
It's just an example of corporate communication completely failing to grasp the gravity of the systemic failure they caused. The financial scale and the public impact demanded a much more profound gesture than a thank you for dealing with the mess.
So, beyond the apology, what were the long-term structural mitigation steps they implemented to ensure this specific point of failure never triggers a global collapse again?
Well, the focus was on decentralizing the risk that was introduced by their rapid release content configuration system. CrowdStrike detailed several key process improvements in their subsequent reports.
They implemented new content configuration test procedures and added additional deployment layers and acceptance checks for the content configuration system before it could ever reach end users.
Which was an admission that their internal QA process was simply not commensurate with the criticality of their product.
And they also brought in outside validation, recognizing that internal review just wasn't enough.
That's right. They engaged 2 independent third-party vendors to thoroughly review the Falcon sensor code, their quality control processes, and the entire content release mechanism.
And critically, they changed the rollout methodology for updates to empower their enterprise clients.
Yes. They began staggering update rollouts, which allows users to select their preferred timing for receiving major configurations. This prevents a single flawed file from simultaneously impacting every single customer worldwide.
So it effectively turns a catastrophic single point of failure into a staggered, controlled deployment failure.
Exactly. It is the ultimate lesson in the consequences of success. Their ability to integrate so deeply into the core operating system, which is what made them the most effective defense, simultaneously made them the most effective single point of failure.
When we synthesize the entire journey of CrowdStrike, from its founding by intelligence experts dedicated to catching sophisticated state-sponsored groups, to its aggressive financial scaling into a multi-billion-dollar utility, we see this profound paradox.
They mastered the highest level of cyber defense. They were tracking complex entities like Chinese military units and Russian intelligence services, accumulating the necessary financial and political power to become truly indispensable to global governance.
And yet, this indispensable status meant that when they introduced a single line of bad logic, it triggered an unprecedented global infrastructure failure.
They built the master lock, only to accidentally break the master key.
The concentration risk is the key takeaway here. Their ability to generate $3.95 billion in revenue, to become an S&P 500 component, was built on the necessary technical deep access of the Falcon sensor.
And that deep access is what allowed them to protect critical systems airports and 9/11 centers, but it is also what gave them the systemic power to globally paralyze those very systems with a single flawed configuration file.
Costing the global economy $5.4 billion.
The entire narrative boils down to the question of who holds the power in the digital age. A single private sector security agent running deep inside the operating systems of global commerce and critical infrastructure has the power to protect against a nation-state attack one day.
And cause a major physical infrastructure collapse the next.
So we leave you with this final provocative thought. As we continue to centralize our defenses, moving further into cloud infrastructure and relying on AI-driven, highly integrated security platforms, we are trading complexity for concentration.
Does this concentration of defensive power ultimately create more stability, or does it introduce a greater, more volatile systemic risk? And how should global governments regulate or even control the few private companies whose operational errors can bring the global economy to a complete standstill?
Think about the answer to that. Until next time.
The deep dive. Done.